Thank you for being here. Welcome. One of the things that I'd love to talk with you about after having read some of your writings, the different journeys that you've been on, starting from growing up in Azerbaijan and then moving to Brooklyn and from there on to other things. Can you talk about that? How about your journey from there to here, wherever here is right now?
Great question and a very long story. It's funny that we're doing this interview now because on August 12th, we're celebrating our 25th anniversary of our immigration. So it's a really interesting time for reflection and has brought up a lot of things for me to think about. And I've been talking about some of these things with my family as well. As you can imagine, there's a lot to be gained through immigration, but there's also a lot of loss. And I think sometimes when you're in the acute phase, when you're just, starting out on your journey here, there's no time to grieve. You're just surviving. So we've been doing a lot of thinking about what's been lost, what's been gained, and what's ahead for all of us as a family and also individually. So a great time for this question. So taking us back, my family is originally from Azerbaijan. We belong to an ethnic group called the Mountain Jews. And the reason that we have that name is because originally we lived in the Caucasus Mountains of Azerbaijan. We lived there for hundreds and hundreds of years in a very remote area. And we came into the capital called Baku because of some fighting that was happening in the mountains at that time. It was becoming very unsafe for the family to be there. So they left and they came to the capital. And as you can imagine, that was a huge change from being in a very remote area to in the middle of a huge city that was very diverse at that time. So they started their journey in the city, and my parents were born in Baku, and I was born in Baku. And throughout their time there, they faced all kinds of different situations, including discrimination for being Jewish. Azerbaijan is primarily a Shia Muslim country, and at the time, it was under the control of the Soviet government. And you might know the Soviet government did not allow for the practice of religion. And Azerbaijan itself was very anti-Semitic on its own. So my parents faced a lot of discrimination in many different ways. And it became worse starting in the late 80s because there was a rise in nationalism in the country. And they wanted to become free from the Soviet Union. So there was this thinking that, anybody who wasn't Muslim needed to leave the country. The Azerbaijan was really for Shia Muslims. Anybody who was Armenian or Jewish or anything else needed to go back to their homeland. So my parents, they made the very difficult decision to leave. And we were choosing between three different countries, Germany, the United States, and Israel. And we were this close to going to Germany. My parents often talk about how the German government had sent them a picture of the apartment that we would have. It was a beautiful apartment. My mom had started to learn German. And last minute, we ended up here because her brother had gotten the opportunity to come here. He was able to sponsor us. So my parents decided, you know what, we have family here. That's good. We need the support. And so they made that decision. And so we came in August of 1999. And as you can imagine, that was a very difficult time for my parents. They had two small children. They didn't know the language. The culture was completely different. They had to get jobs, go back to school. It was very complicated. And we as kids, it was hard for us as well because our first language was Russian. We didn't speak English at all. It was very confusing. I remember being in school for the first time, being very confused and very scared, not knowing what was going on. And, as a child, I always say that it's a little bit easier for us because, you forget a lot of that pain as you get older. For my parents, it was harder because they were in their 30s and 50s. They had lived a whole life. It was a lot harder for them. For us, I think, you forget as a child some of the difficulty, which I'm grateful for. I kind of don't want to remember, I think, some of the hard stuff. But so those first few years, I think we were in survival mode for a long time, just trying to figure out who we were in this new country. And my dad was actually, he worked in public health. And here he couldn't practice because he didn't have the language skills, he didn't have the licensure. So he ended up working as a home attendant, and then a nurse's aide, and then he retired a couple of years ago. And my mom was a teacher, went back to school here and was able to work as a teacher. So early on, I was exposed to medicine through my dad. I was fascinated by it. I loved science, loved the idea of being of service to folks, um, and started on that journey and thought that that was gonna, that was gonna be my career. Um, and I took the typical pre-med path. I went to Hunter College, was a bio major. I was part of this wonderful honors program called the Macaulay Honors Program. Had free tuition, which was really important for an immigrant family. And sometime in my sophomore year, I began to have doubts about if whether medicine was right for me or not. I had been a writer my entire life and loved storytelling. And I was in the middle of these very difficult science classes and was having a very hard time connecting with the material. Found myself very bored, not engaged, didn't feel connected to the community at Hunter, who was pre-med. I didn't like how toxic it was very competitive, and I'm not a competitive person at all. So it was very wrong in many different ways for me, but I stuck it out because I felt like I put in so many years already. I didn't want to rock the boat. I didn't know what else I would do with my life. At the time, I was too scared to pursue writing full time. And I wish, I had talked to somebody about it, but I didn't. I kind of sucked it up and went forward. And I ended up at Mount Sinai, which is a wonderful medical school. Enjoyed my time there, but also had that feeling on my gut that like, hey, something is wrong. And I always tell people that, it's like being married to the wrong person, and you're married to them for 30 years. And one day you get up and you look at them and you're like, I can't be married to this person anymore. I don't love them. I need to leave, it was like that for me. During my third year, I had a very hard time. I was very depressed. I was very anxious all the time, deeply unhappy. And at the beginning of my fourth year, I decided, you know what? I'm not doing a residency. I'm leaving medicine. I'm going to figure things out. And I told my parents. And as you can imagine, it was really hard for them to process for a lot of different reasons. I think they were scared for me, first and foremost, that I had put in so much work and what was going to happen to me and how was I going to support myself. And a lot of that has to do with the immigrant kind of mentality, right? That it's all about survival. And eventually they came around, and I spent that entire last year of med school job hunting and talking to people and networking, and eventually ended up at my current job, which is in biotech communications. So long story short, a lot of journeys, right? The journey out of Azerbaijan to the United States and the journey of myself out of medicine into writing, into storytelling. And I'm still very much figuring out what I want to do with my life and where I'm really supposed to be. It's an ongoing question for me and something that kind of haunts me every day a little bit. It's a difficult question to live with, but also it's a great privilege because, I recognize how lucky I am that I even get to explore. Something that I want to make a note of is that, where I'm from, women often were not allowed to be educated. My grandmother was pulled out of school when she was 15 years old and she was forced to marry somebody in his early 20s. So I'm just so grateful that I even have the opportunity to have an education and think about these big questions because so many women of my family did not have that opportunity.
Well, one thing I'm really struck with is, well, first the bravery of your parents. Well, maybe they didn't really have a choice, but it sounds like it was a really hard decision to leave. And I guess I was also wondering of in your family who was left behind. But the decisions to change one's life, uh, uproot yourself and move elsewhere, seems to be where you are right now with your current field. And actually in this country, it's not uncommon for people to have three different careers. I'm on the third or fourth one in my long life so far. So it's not uncommon. So but to make the decision to not pursue medicine seemed to, as you were saying, was a big decision. And was it a source of relief, but also a source of anxiety at the same time?
Yeah, it was an immense sense of relief, Tony. I can't even describe it to you. It's like somebody really took this ton of bricks off my back. Actually, it's been just over 5 years. I decided July 15th of 2019. And funny enough, I decided in the middle of the street in front of Mount Sinai on Madison Avenue, if you know that area on the Upper East Side. I had come out of a meeting with the program director of the internal medicine residency at the time. And during the meeting, he tells me, "Oh, you're a great candidate. You have a great step score. Your clerkships were wonderful. Can't wait to have you, you know." And I sat there and I looked at him, and all I thought was, what am I doing with my life? This is so wrong. He's so excited for me, but I feel nothing. I am numb. I'm
Yeah.
not excited about any of this. And so I left his office and I was wearing a black dress, I remember, which I feel like is very symbolic, right? I was kind of attending a funeral of sorts. I was burying something. And I decided in the middle of the street, you know what? I'm not doing this anymore. And as I, made that decision, I felt an immense sense of relief immediately. I felt happier in that moment than I had in the previous 6 years of my life. And actually, 2 weeks later, I took step two CK, which is an 8-hour exam, 8 or 9 hour exam, as you can imagine. And I told my parents the very next day about my decision, and they were very anxious and scared. But I was very happy. I didn't even have any anxiety because I knew that I was doing the right thing for me. And yes, it was terrifying for the first time to really choose me, but also, damn, wasn't it freeing? It was amazing.
But I'm also really interested in the effect of being exposed to 4 different languages, or maybe more. What else did you hear growing up in Azerbaijan and even perhaps in Brooklyn when you came here that might have affected your love of language? Is that an influence?
It's a great question to me. So I often joke with people that in my household, one sentence could have 4 languages in it. That was a common thing in our household. Um, so my first language was Russian. And then when I came here, I learned English. And we had 2 other languages in our household. One is Azeri, which is my mom's native language. It's the language of Azerbaijan, very similar to Turkish. And then the last one is a language called Juhuri, or Judeo-Tat, which is the language of our ethnic group, and it's a very old language. It's a variant of Farsi, actually, the language spoken in Iran. So my parents, they speak varying levels of fluency in Azeri and Judeo-Tat, and I understand bits and pieces of those 2 languages. And then, of course, Russian was my first, and English is my current language. Um, I love languages. I remember being a child, and one of my first memories is of my dad reading to me. And I remember feeling so fascinated by the storytelling aspect of things. And I remember my dad teaching me Cyrillic, the Russian alphabet. And I remember being fascinated by the letters, the textures of the letters, and how they came together. So really early memories of being fascinated by the most basic parts of language, things that I think most people don't even think about. I was already fascinated by at 5 years old. And when I came here, I learned English and immediately became a voracious reader. Totally fell in love with storytelling and taking in stories. And then I began to write poetry actually when I was in 2nd grade. We had a poetry workshop. A Zen Buddhist monk actually came and did a workshop with us, believe it or not, and introduced poetry into my life. And it was love at first sight. I fell in love with it completely. It was amazing. And I never stopped writing it. And I also began to write personal essays, so reflections about, what was happening in my life and my family's life, my friends. So those 2 kinds of writing are really what I do today: poetry and creative nonfiction / personal essays. So to answer your question, absolutely. I think surrounded by so many languages in my household and also in Brooklyn, growing up in Brooklyn, I mean, we're spoiled rotten with all these languages. I think it definitely had an influence on me. And to this day, I'm obsessed with etymology and learning different tidbits of languages.
Um, what is the relationship, do you think, between poetry and being multilingual?
There's a flexibility in your thinking. Because my mind has been exposed to so many languages, I feel like I'm really playful with my poetry and I see things in words that maybe other people don't see, if that makes sense. The way that I break down words and ideas, the cadence of my writing, I think is all influenced by the languages that I've been exposed to. Love bug. It happened in the grocery store at the height of the pandemic in New York. I had just finished a night shift, hollowed out under eyes, buzzing with coffee, hair wet from a shower at home. And there I was in aisle 5, the 7-year-old in me really craving mac and cheese. And as I found myself reaching for the last box, I saw you from the corner of my eye, looking at the same lonely box, your weary eyes like mirrors of mine. It's funny, my mother had been bugging me about being single more than usual lately. Mom, we're in the middle of a global crisis. And would it kill you to put on a bit of eyeshadow? I offered you to the last box, but you didn't want to take it, reaching for a can of soup instead. How many did you lose this week? Too many, you say. Me too. With my usual anxiety about this kind of stuff overpowered by lack of sleep, I ask, will you come over for dinner? My mac and cheese, your can of soup. Maybe we'll even throw together a salad. We can make a feast out of it. And it was written when I was a 4th-year medical student during the pandemic. You might remember that in April of 2020, New York City was the epicenter of the pandemic in the entire, not only the country, but globally. It was a very difficult time. And I was living by myself in that dorm. All of my roommates had left. I was doing a lot of writing, and this is one of the poems that I wrote.
What resonated to you at that time that went into the writing of this piece?
It's funny, I was going through a phase of time where I was eating a lot of mac and cheese. And I'm thinking about it now, and I'm like, why did I love it so much at that time? And I think it was because it was comforting. It
Comfort food.
reminded me of being a kid. Yeah. And I think we all needed a little bit of comfort at that time. And for me, being alone in that dorm room,
Yeah.
I needed that. And mac and cheese reminded me of being a kid and being at home with my parents. And so I was craving a lot of it. Um, and I was in the grocery store and you know, you might remember that we had a lot of shortages at the time and the shelves were often empty. And there was this one box of mac and cheese that was left. I remember this one particular day that I went and I looked at the box of mac and cheese and it made me a little sad to see it all alone on the shelf like that. And from that one moment, I created this whole story, imagining 2 people meeting over this mac and cheese, 2 people who are in medicine, who are going through a lot, and they're both looking for connection, for humanity, and they find it in the grocery store over a very simple thing. After 3 years go by, you appear on 2 slides in a lecture on motor neuron disease. 2 slides. When we first met, you were putting on red lipstick, and they told me that you were dying, and I couldn't move, as if my muscles suddenly decided to mimic yours. 2 slides that tell me what I already know: neurodegenerative, incurable, fatal. 3 years, I know that you're gone, and that makes me want to red lipstick my mouth, our desks, and those goddamn 2 slides. Man, that was 10 years ago. I was shadowing at Cornell, actually, right before my last year of college. And we visited a patient who was hospitalized with ALS. She was hospitalized because she had to get a feeding tube placed. She was losing mobility. And when we walked into the room, I'll never forget it. She had this beautiful long blonde hair. She was beautifully dressed and she was putting on lipstick, bright red lipstick. And with ALS, you lose your ability to move over time. And her hands were all gnarled and deformed. She couldn't really hold the lipstick properly anymore, but she was holding onto the tube for dear life and just trying her best to put on lipstick. And that was, you know, how I met her. That was the first image of her that I had. And it hit me like a truck. I'll never forget it. It gives me chills to this day because I saw immediately what kind of person she was, how resilient she was, that in that moment when she was so sick, she was still trying her best to feel like herself, to fight in the way that she could fight. Um, so this poem came out of that experience, watching her, and I in that poem I also reflect on how I thought about her years later because we had a lecture on ALS, and I was looking at the slides, and all I could think about was this person that I had met and how she was more than these symptoms, and how maybe nobody else in the room understood what this disease did to a person. And I became angry too about, how much these diseases steal from us. So the poem is a reflection of all of that.
Yeah. It really strikes me that even though you're not practicing medicine, it really resonates with you. Like through this poem and the previous one, that it provides kind of rich material to draw on.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It's very insightful. I think it's what kept me in medicine for so long because I was fascinated by the people that I was meeting.
Mhm.
I met so many incredible people, from the patients to the providers to just random interactions I had in the elevator at the medical school. And I would go home and I would write like little things in the margins of my notebooks, or on the train. That kept me inspired and going. But yeah, absolutely. There's such a richness of narrative, no matter where you go, but particularly in medicine, because people in that space are often coming to you on the worst day of their lives, and you're bearing witness to a lot of pain. And I think you have to be very open in that moment and receive everything they're giving you, right? And I always felt so privileged to be with them in that moment. I felt like I was holding something really precious. And how lucky was I that I got to meet these people and get to know them. And I wanted to write about them because I wanted to honor them. I wanted people to know about these incredible folks that I had met.
Mhm. If you were to design a perfect job description for you that incorporated medicine, if that's at all possible, what would it look like?
Good
Well,
question.
if you were given a free hand, someone hired you at a med school or a hospital or something and said, pursue your passion here, what would it look like for you?
It's a great question. I thought about this actually. I think it would be exactly what I did as a medical student, where I got to walk into a room, talk to somebody for an hour, and get to know their story, but without the medical part. So I think I would go into a room and not necessarily have to know the medical details of what was going on, but get to know them as a person and be able to create something for them, whether it was a poem or some kind of essay, or maybe collaborate with a visual artist on telling their story. Um, and we could keep that private, or we could keep it, public, whatever the patient would be comfortable with. But I think it would be that, like, getting to know people, profiling them in some way, and sharing that with the world if I could.
Yeah, it's I wonder if you're also one of the unintended consequences of the business model of medicine that really doesn't allow for a lot of time to get to know the patient except for the biomedical information. When you're seeing people quickly every 7 to 12 minutes, it's really hard to get to know them as people. And when I've worked for residents, I've asked like, what's the big downside of empathy? And they said, well, it takes time.
Yeah.
They might really start to talk, and then you'll run out of time. And I always thought that was, and I kind of knew what the answer was because I kept hearing it over and over again, but I wanted them to say it. And I think it's true. It's maybe you haven't left medicine, but medicine has left you.
Yeah, it's interesting. The storytelling aspect again was what kept me in, I think, for so many years.
Yeah.
I just was so fascinated and so honored to be with these people. Every interaction that I had, I learned something and I was inspired. I mean, I was just so lucky. But I think you also have to be open to these kinds of experiences. I had classmates who they approach things differently. They had different goals, and I don't judge them for that. For me, I was really focused on the story, and it became very clear to me that I wasn't getting what I needed from medicine, that I needed to leave so that I could do this kind of work the way that, I wanted to do it. And I knew that it was effective because, I would share my work with people all the time and they were touched by it and they related to it. So I knew that it meant something to people. I needed to keep pursuing it in some way.